Hello, Bio20, and welcome to the respiratory system. Today, we are going to be talking about the structures and functions. So, your goals today are learning how to identify the parts of the respiratory systems, as well as talking about how we bring oxygen into our body and release out carbon dioxide. How you know you have learned this is you can identify the structures of the respiratory system by looking at a diagram. You can explain those functions of each of the parts of the respiratory system. You're also going to have the opportunity to look at the parts of a pig pluck, which is essentially the lungs and trachea of a pig, and be able to see how those actually relate to what we've talked about in the video, as well as explain how pressure helps air move in and out of your lungs. So we're going to start with this diagram, which is in your notes. I'm not going to explain the functions at this point. All we are going to do right now is we are going to write down what each of these is called. So we're going to start at number 1, which is the nasal passage, or your nose. Number 2 is your mouth. Number 3 is the larynx. Number 4 is the lung. Number 5 is the bronchi. Number 6 is the diaphragm. Number 7 is the pharynx. Number 8 is the trachea. Number 9 is the bronchi. 10 is the bronchiole. And 11 is the alveoli. Now you'll notice you've written bronchi down twice, and that's because you have two bronchi. Your trachea goes down through your sternum, like through your nasal passage down through the back where your throat is, past your larynx and all that, and then branches out into two spaces, which are the bronchi. So there's two there, the left and right. Now what I would do is maybe pause here and make sure you have them all written down. What I would like you to do now is just find a little space somewhere to do a little drawing with me. So number 11 is the alveoli. So what I would like to do is I'd like to zoom in to the alveoli. So here it is. If we were to go and look at what an alveoli looks like, it looks like this. It's a tube structure right here, which is the bronchiole. And the bronchiole will branch down until it's really, really small, and then it'll branch into these lovely grape bunches, I kind of call them, which are referred to as alveoli. You'll notice that they're covered in a net-like structure. That net-like structure is actually capillaries. So they're for the circulatory system. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where the respiratory system and the circulatory system meet. Gas exchange happens here. So what we have at structure A, once you have this drawn and labeled, is a capillary. Structure B right here is the alveoli itself, or alveolus. And then we have two ways that we can talk about blood. So the blood coming into the capillaries has been in your body and lacking oxygen. So we would call this oxygen poor blood. It went to our muscles, dropped off all the oxygen, got pumped back to our heart, and our heart sent it to our lungs. So there's very little oxygen in here. So the blood comes in and passes over these alveoli, gas exchange occurs, and then it leaves. When it leaves, we call it oxygen-rich blood. So this is the big picture, the big structures, and this is the tiny picture of where gas exchange actually occurs. So let's get into what each of these things do. All right, and we're going to talk about them in depth. So again, one of the things that you will know, you have to understand, is the functions. So you saw the structures. Let's now talk about the functions. Now, you'll notice something like epiglottis was not on your diagram. And that's okay, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the epiglottis a little bit more in digestion, but you can still write down its function now. So the first one is the nasal passage, or your nose. Now the key part to your nose is that it warms the air coming into as you take a deep breath in, okay? Now the other thing that's really important you have to understand about your nasal passage is that as you breathe in, you have little tiny hairs in your nose called cilia, and these clean the air from any sort of bacteria. So the idea is it wants to make sure that you're not getting sick. So that's one of your lines of defenses of your body, your nose, the back of your throat, and your trachea are actually lined with things called cilia, trapping bacteria, mucus, and all that stuff is in there as well. So mucus, or the snot in your nose, also is trapping any foreign objects. So that's the nasal passage and the key things: warming the air, using the cilia to clean the air, and keeping mucus in there to help trap foreign objects. Your nasal passage is actually connected to your mouth via the pharynx. So your nasal passage goes back down towards your pharynx. Your mouth also connects to your pharynx. So that's why you can breathe in when you feel like a sniff, you feel like you got the sniffles and you feel like you have a lot of snot in your nose, and you breathe in, you go and you breathe in really deep, and then you feel like you can like make a mucus ball by like making that weird sound in your throat. It's because they're connected. Okay, so you can get rid of mucus from your nose out of your mouth. Now, your pharynx is the area that connects your nose to your mouth. It's also the area where your tonsils are located. Tonsils are little tiny nodules that are part of the lymphatic system, and they're located in your throat. Some people may have them and some people may not, because you can have your tonsils removed if they get inflamed too many times. We'll talk about that when we talk about diseases and tonsillitis. The epiglottis, which you don't have listed on your diagram, is essentially just this little cartilage flap that covers the lid to the larynx and stops food. It shouldn't say the larynx, the esophagus, sorry. The lid to the esophagus, and it stops food from passing into your airway. So it's there to like block where the larynx and the esophagus is, so that you don't, when you're eating food, you don't choke. Your larynx is your voice box, and it's made out of cartilage. If you start talking and take your hand and put it on your throat, you can actually feel vibrations in your throat. And that's because your voice box has vocal cords that vibrate, that allow for you to make sound that then your mouth creates words with. Your trachea is also cartilaginous, or made of cartilage, and it's the airway. It's lined with mucus and cilia. And again, its goal is to stop bacteria from entering the lungs. Now, the trachea is a tube, and the cartilage in that tube keeps it open all the time. So the trachea isn't like a muscle like your small intestine or your esophagus, which you'll see in a couple chapters here. It's not made of a smooth muscle like we talked about in chapter 10 about muscles. It's made out of cartilage, which if you feel the top of your ear, that's cartilage. It's a little bit bendy, but it's tough. Your nose is at the tip is made out of cartilage, okay? So its job is to keep the airway open. Your bronchi are the Y split from the trachea. So they moisten and clean the air as it enters the lungs. From there, it enters into the bronchioles, which are narrowing tubes, okay? And then they branch into lots of different other branches as it makes its way down to the alveoli. Now, the pleural membrane, which is going to be essentially your lungs. So your lungs are covered by this thin membrane. So number 4 on your diagram was the lung. You could also put /pleural membrane because it's essentially the lining of the lungs. And in order for gas exchange to actually occur, your lungs need to be a little bit moist. So the pleural membrane actually helps with that by keeping the lungs moistened. You can get bacterial infections of your pleural membranes, which causes them to like become very swollen, and then it becomes extremely painful to breathe because you don't have that moistening of the lungs for gas exchange. Alveoli, which we kind of already talked about, are the air sacs at the end of the bronchioles. It's a site of gas exchange. They're covered in capillaries, and they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. The diaphragm is probably the most important part of the story, or one of the most important parts of the stories. It is the reason why you can breathe in, because it's a muscle. And as a muscle, it pulls and it contracts down so that it can give room for your lungs to inflate. If we couldn't move the diaphragm, our lungs wouldn't be able to inflate very much. So the intercostal muscles are the next important piece. The intercostal muscles are the muscles that line your ribs. If you take your hands and you feel along the side of your body, just under where your armpit is, you can feel your ribs, but you can kind of feel that there's a little soft spot in between each rib. That's where your intercostal muscles sit. And essentially what they do is they help the ribs move up and out when breathing in. So ladies and gentlemen, Bio 20s, I really need you to make sure that you have all the structures and the functions listed, and make sure you're reviewing them so that you understand them, because they're going to be an important part as we learn how our lungs inflate. If you have any questions, please let me know.